Have you ever wondered how a simple sentence can transform the world? At the dawn of the 13th century, when the Church was facing great challenges, there arose a man whose life would forever change the course of Catholic spirituality. Dominic de Guzmán, born on Spanish soil, not only founded one of the most influential religious orders in history, but also received from the very hands of the Virgin Mary the most precious gift, the Holy Rosary. This powerful devotion, which intertwines the meditation on the mysteries of Christ with the intercession of the Mother of God, would become a spiritual bulwark for millions of the faithful through the centuries. Chapter 1. The Seed of Holiness. In the small town of Caleruega, in the province of Burgos, Spain, under the Castilian sky of 1170, a child was born destined to illuminate the Church with his fervor and wisdom. The son of Félix de Guzmán and Juana de Aza, both of noble lineage, Dominic was born into a deeply Christian family. His mother, a woman of extraordinary virtue, had a prophetic dream during her pregnancy. She saw a puppy with a lit torch in its snout, foreshadowing that her son would ignite the fire of faith throughout the world. From his earliest years, Dominic showed a natural inclination toward the sacred. While other children played, he found solace in contemplation and silent prayer. His parents, recognizing this special disposition, nurtured in him the Christian virtues with care and dedication. The charity observed at home left an indelible mark on his heart. While still very young, during a terrible famine that struck Castile, he was deeply moved by watching his mother distribute food to those in need. Young Dominic demonstrated an early sharp intelligence and a prodigious memory, qualities his parents decided to channel into formal education. At the age of 7, he was entrusted to his maternal uncle, the archpriest of Gumiel de Izan, who initiated him in the studies of grammar, rhetoric, and the Holy Scriptures. In that atmosphere of reflection and study, the boy developed a profound love for the Word of God, spending long hours meditating on the sacred texts. Dominic's adolescence passed far from the clamor of the world, forging in him a serene and contemplative character. His contemporaries noted his extraordinary composure, his luminous gaze, and an expression that radiated inner peace. Yet he was not indifferent to the suffering of others. On more than one occasion, moved by the misery of those around him, he offered his own clothes and belongings to ease the pain of the less fortunate. In his early youth, an event would definitively mark his path toward holiness. While accompanying his mother on a pilgrimage to the sanctuary of Santo Domingo de Silos to pray for the health of a sick relative, he had a profound mystical experience during a night vigil. There, before the tomb of the saintly abbot, he felt for the first time an inner call inviting him to devote his life completely to the service of God and the Church. That night, as the stars kept vigil over his prayer, young Dominic understood that his destiny was sealed by the divine will. Chapter 2. Years of Formation. At the age of 14, when many noble youths were preparing for courtly or military life, Dominic set out for Palencia, where one of the most prestigious centers of higher learning on the Iberian Peninsula flourished. In those classrooms, under the guidance of erudite masters, the young student quickly distinguished himself for his dedication and incisive intelligence. For 10 years, he immersed himself in the study of the liberal arts, philosophy, and finally, theology, a discipline that captivated his soul, thirsty for eternal truths. The nights in Palencia silently witnessed Dominic's long vigils. While his companions rested, he would remain bent over the sacred texts by the dim light of a candle, absorbed in the meditation of the divine mysteries. His teachers observed with admiration how that seemingly frail young man possessed an uncommon inner strength. He drank eagerly from the water of wisdom, one of his professors would later write, like parched earth that finally receives the beneficial rain. During these years of study, an event revealed the deep compassion that resided in his heart. A terrible famine struck the region of Palencia, sowing death and desolation among the humblest families. Moved by the suffering he witnessed daily, Dominic made a radical decision. He sold his precious books, carefully annotated over years of study, and gave all the money to help the starving. "How can one study dead parchments?" he told those surprised by his gesture, "when the children of God, the living image of the Creator, are dying of hunger." This heroic act of charity made a profound impression on the city, inspiring other students and teachers to follow his example. The fame of his wisdom and virtue reached the ears of Bishop Martin de Bazan, who soon brought him into the chapter of the Osma Cathedral. There, under the guidance of Prior Diego de Acebes, Dominic embraced community life according to the rule of St. Augustine. The young canon found in Diego not only a superior, but a spiritual father and friend who recognized in him an instrument chosen by Providence for great deeds. Together, they spent long hours in prayer, sharing their hopes for reform and renewal for a church facing difficult times. In the silence of the Osma cloister, among psalms and meditation, Dominic purified his spirit and strengthened his will. His community brothers admired his extraordinary ability to combine contemplative fervor with the rigorous study of Christian doctrine. His face always reflected a serene joy, one of the canons would later recall, except when he was moved by the recounting of some sin or human suffering. Then his eyes filled with tears and his heart burned with the desire to save souls for Christ. Before we continue, we would like to know, were you aware of the story of this great saint? Tell us in the comments. Chapter 3. The Apostolic Call. The year 1203 marked a turning point in Dominic's life when King Alfonso VIII entrusted Bishop Diego de Acebes with a delicate diplomatic mission to Denmark. Recognizing Dominic's exceptional qualities, Diego chose him as his travel companion. The two crossed the Pyrenees and ventured into the lands of the Languedoc, where they were dismayed by the advance of the Albigensian heresy, which denied fundamental aspects of the Catholic faith and caused deep divisions in entire communities. That first foray into French lands allowed Dominic to grasp the gravity of the situation. During a night's stay in Toulouse, he had the opportunity to engage in a lengthy conversation with the innkeeper, a sincere man, yet deeply influenced by heretical doctrines. The conversation stretched until dawn, and when the first rays of the sun illuminated the room, the man, moved by Dominic's wisdom and charity, renounced his errors and returned to the fold of the church. This first apostolic fruit ignited in the saint's heart a burning desire to dedicate his life to preaching the truth. After the mission in Denmark, Diego and Dominic began their journey back to Spain, stopping in Rome to visit Pope Innocent III. The bishop, impressed by what they had witnessed, requested permission to resign his episcopal see and devote himself to evangelizing the Albigensians. However, the pontiff considered it more prudent for Diego to retain his episcopal office, but authorized them to embark on an evangelizing mission in the south of France, following the example of the apostles, without riches, on foot, and trusting in divine providence. In the spring of 1206, Diego and Dominic returned to the Languedoc and began their missionary work with a revolutionary approach for the time. Instead of traveling with the usual pomp of papal legates, they adopted a radical austerity that contrasted with the luxury surrounding many prelates. Barefoot, poorly dressed, and begging for their sustenance, they began preaching through the testimony of their lives even before speaking a word. This method made a deep impression on the common people, who saw in these missionaries a more authentic reflection of the gospel they preached. After 2 years of intense missionary work with his mentor, Dominic faced a painful trial when Diego, feeling ill, decided to temporarily return to his diocese and soon died. Alone in a foreign land and facing an immense task, many would have given up. However, Dominic interpreted this loss as a sign that God was calling him to fully assume his apostolic vocation. "I will fear no evil, "For you are with me," he would repeat, echoing the psalmist, as he traveled through villages and cities, fervently preaching the Catholic doctrine and facing with meekness the mockery and threats of his adversaries. Chapter 4. The Mission among the Cathars. In the green hills and fertile valleys of the Languedoc, where troubadour culture flourished alongside prosperous commerce, the Cathar, or Albigensian heresy, spread rapidly. Its followers, inspired by ancient Gnostic and Manichaean doctrines, rejected the incarnation of Christ, the sacraments, and the authority of the Church, causing deep confusion among the faithful. Dominic understood that to effectively combat this error, intellectual arguments alone were not enough. A living evangelical testimony was needed to contrast with the austerity displayed by the perfect Cathars. Established in Prouille, alongside a small Marian sanctuary, Dominic began to organize his apostolate systematically. During the day, he tirelessly traveled through villages and hamlets, preaching in squares, markets, and even along the roadside. His words, infused with evangelical fire and deep theological knowledge, attracted multitudes. He did not seek to humiliate his adversaries in public debates, but rather to enlighten consciences with the light of truth. "Not with the sword, but with the word," he would say to those advocating violent methods against heretics. Dominic's nights revealed the secret of his fruitful apostolate. While everyone else slept, he remained in prayer, shedding tears for the salvation of souls. Often guests at the houses where he stayed found him in the early hours, prostrated before an improvised crucifix, with his arms outstretched in a cross, or scourging his body in vicarious penance for sinners. "Lord, what shall become of the sinners?" he was heard exclaiming amid sobs. This contemplative and penitential dimension of his life earned him deep respect, even among those who did not share his faith. One of the most innovative aspects of his apostolate was the founding of the monastery of Prouille to shelter young converts from Catharism. Many noble families, adherents of the heresy, sent their daughters to houses run by perfect Cathars for their education. Dominic, understanding the problem, established a community where these young women could receive training in the Catholic faith in an atmosphere of prayer and study. Prouille thus became the first institutional fruit of his apostolic zeal and the seed of the future female branch of his order. One day, while returning from an exhausting day of preaching, Dominic was ambushed by a group of heretics who, angered by his evangelizing successes, had decided to end his life. "What would you do if we captured you?" they threatened. With surprising serenity, the saint replied, "I would beg you not to kill me in one stroke, but to prolong my martyrdom by cutting off my limbs one by one, leaving my trunk drenched in blood, and finally decapitating me, so that I might have greater merit before my Lord." Perplexed by that response, which revealed a sincere longing for martyrdom, the attackers allowed him to continue on his way, moved by a courage that could only stem from authentic faith. Chapter 5. The Foundation of the Order of Preachers. After years of itinerant preaching, Dominic realized that his work needed an institutional framework to ensure its continuity. In 1215, accompanied by Bishop Fulco of Toulouse, he traveled to Rome to attend the Fourth Lateran Council convened by Pope Innocent III. The saint presented his project to the pontiff to found a religious order dedicated specifically to doctrinal preaching and the defense of the faith, a novelty at the time, since this task was traditionally reserved for bishops. Although receptive to the idea, Innocent III asked Dominic to adopt an already existing rule, as the council had forbidden the creation of new religious rules. After deep prayer and discernment, Dominic chose the rule of St. Augustine for its flexibility and communal focus, complementing it with his own constitutions that emphasized study, preaching, and mendicant poverty. On December 22, 1216, Pope Honorius III, successor to Innocent, issued the bull Religiosum Vitam, officially approving the order of preachers. The following summer, in a gesture that revealed the audacity of his apostolic vision, Dominic gathered his first 16 followers at Pruy and made a decision that many considered reckless. He dispersed them to found new communities. "We are like seeds," he told them with prophetic conviction, "which will bear fruit if scattered, but will rot if clumped together." Thus, he sent friars to Paris, the intellectual center of Europe, to Bologna, famous for its law schools, to Rome, the heart of Christendom, and to Spain, his native land, laying the foundations of an order that would soon spread throughout Christendom. The most significant innovation of the new order was its emphasis on study as an indispensable preparation for preaching. Dominic insisted that his friars be the light of the world and the salt of the earth through a solid theological formation. He established convents near emerging universities and mandated that each province have its own schools of theology. "A preacher without knowledge is like a soldier without arms," he used to say. This educational vision would revolutionize clerical training and contribute decisively to the intellectual flourishing of the Church in the centuries to come. The internal organization of the order also reflected Dominic's innovative mindset. Instead of the traditional hierarchical model, he established a system of government based on regular chapters in which the friars democratically elected their superiors and participated in formulating the laws that would govern their communal life. The saint himself, when presiding over these assemblies, would affirm, "I am the same Dominic, but I am with you as one among equals." This participatory structure, unusual for its time, demonstrated his trust in shared responsibility and in the inspiration of the Holy Spirit acting through the community. Chapter 6. The Marian Apparition. In the summer of 1214, while the mission in the Languedoc faced particularly difficult moments, Dominic withdrew to the forest near Toulouse to intensify his life of prayer and penance. For 3 days and 3 nights, he remained in strict fasting, flogging his body and shedding tears for the conversion of the heretics. His emaciated face and weakened body revealed the extreme sacrifice he offered for the salvation of souls, to the point where he seemed more dead than alive. On the 3rd night, when his exhaustion had reached its limit, a celestial light suddenly illuminated the darkness of the forest. Before his astonished eyes, the Most Holy Virgin Mary appeared, surrounded by an indescribable radiance and accompanied by 3 angels of extraordinary beauty. Dominic's heart, inflamed with love and reverence, could barely contain the emotion of that heavenly encounter. The Mother of God looked at him with maternal tenderness and spoke in a sweet voice that penetrated to the depths of his soul. "Do you know, my dear Dominic," the Virgin asked, "with what weapon did the Most Holy Trinity reform the world?" The saint, aware of his smallness before the divine mystery, humbly replied, "O Lady, you know better than I do, for after your Son, Jesus Christ, you were the principal instrument of our salvation." The Queen of Heaven, pleased with his answer, then revealed, "Know that the principal piece of the battery was the angelic salutation, which is the foundation of the New Testament. And therefore, if you wish to win over those hardened hearts for God, pray my Psalter." In that solemn moment, the Most Holy Mary handed Dominic the Rosary, personally teaching him how to pray it and promising that this devotion would be a powerful weapon against heresies, a refuge in calamities, and an effective means to obtain divine graces. She explained in detail how this prayer combined the repetition of the Hail Marys with the meditation on the principal mysteries of Christ's life, thus uniting the simplicity accessible to the common people with the theological depth necessary to nourish faith. Strengthened by this mystical experience and bearing the precious heavenly gift, Dominic returned to Toulouse, transformed inwardly with renewed apostolic vigor. He immediately began to preach this devotion among the faithful, teaching them to count the Hail Marys using knots in ropes, since beaded rosaries did not yet exist, and to meditate on the mysteries of redemption. The spiritual fruits soon became evident. Surprising conversions, reconciliations among enemies, the strengthening of faith among the wavering, and a general rebirth of Christian piety in regions where heresy had once prevailed. Chapter 7. The Miracle of Toulouse. Shortly after the Marian apparition, Dominic went to the Cathedral of Toulouse to publicly announce the new devotion he had received. That day, a strange unease seemed to hang in the air as the faithful gathered in the temple. Inexplicably, the cathedral bells began to toll on their own, without any human hand to ring them, as if heaven itself were summoning the city for an extraordinary event. When Dominic ascended the pulpit, his countenance radiated a supernatural light that impressed everyone present. He had barely begun to speak about divine mercy and Mary's intercession when, suddenly, the sky darkened as if night had fallen in the middle of the day. A violent tremor shook the foundations of the cathedral, causing many to fear that the building might collapse upon them. At the same time, blinding lightning illuminated the stained glass, and deafening thunder seemed to announce the end of the world, plunging the crowd into indescribable terror. In the midst of all this chaos, only Dominic remained serene, his eyes fixed on an image of the Virgin Mary presiding over the high altar. To the astonishment of all, the sacred image came to life and raised its arms toward the sky 3 times in a gesture of supplication, as if pleading with God for justice for those who rejected the grace offered through the Rosary. Understanding the meaning of that sign, the saint knelt and began fervently praying the prayers of the Holy Rosary, inviting the faithful to join him. As the Hail Marys flowed from the lips of the assembly, an astonishing phenomenon began to occur. The storm gradually subsided, the lightning spaced out, the thunder receded, and little by little, the sunlight broke through the clouds again. When the recitation of the Rosary ended, the sky had completely regained its serenity, as if the tempest had never existed. A profound, awe-inspiring silence filled the cathedral as those present marveled at what had happened. With renewed fervor, Dominic resumed his preaching, explaining how the Rosary served as a safe refuge against the spiritual and material tempests that threatened Christian life. His words, infused with the supernatural experience they had just shared, deeply touched the hearts of all. That day, practically the entire city of Toulouse embraced the devotion to the Rosary, and many who had sympathized with the Albigensian heresy returned to the fold of the Catholic Church, moved by such an evident sign of divine favor. In the following weeks, a remarkable change was observed in the life of the people of Toulouse. Blasphemies decreased, acts of charity flourished, estranged families reconciled, and religious vocations multiplied. The cathedral, once rarely attended, now filled daily with the faithful who gathered to pray the Rosary in community. That spiritual transformation stood as a living testament to the power of Marian devotion to renew society from its very foundations. Did you find it surprising to learn how the Most Holy Virgin personally delivered the Rosary to St. Dominic? This devotion, which has transformed millions of lives over the centuries, began with a mystical encounter in the forest. Do you also pray the Holy Rosary? Share in the comments how this powerful prayer has influenced your spiritual journey. Chapter 8. The Expansion of the Rosary. Aware of the spiritual treasure entrusted to him, Dominic made the preaching of the Rosary a central element of his itinerant apostolate. Whenever he arrived in a new town, he gathered the people in the local church or public square, and with simple yet anointed words taught them to weave together the meditation on the mysteries of Christ with the repetitive prayer of the Hail Mary. To facilitate this practice among mostly illiterate people, he devised visual representations of the mysteries and mnemonic methods that helped remember the sequence of prayers. The accounts of the first Dominican biographers record numerous miracles associated with the spread of this devotion. In Carcassonne, a woman possessed by evil spirits was instantly freed when Dominic placed a rosary on her head. In Montpellier, a group of merchants was miraculously saved during a sea storm after invoking the Virgin by the method taught by the saint. In Albi, the center of Catharism, a heretical preacher was rendered temporarily mute while publicly contradicting the teachings about the Rosary, regaining his speech only after renouncing his errors. As the order of preachers spread throughout Europe, its friars became tireless propagators of the Rosary. Dominic established the practice that each new convent should organize monthly Marian processions, where common people could participate in this devotion in a communal and festive way. These public manifestations of faith, accompanied by hymns and banners bearing the image of the Virgin, decisively contributed to popularizing the Rosary even in regions where the Dominican presence was still scarce. Dominic's pastoral ingenuity shines especially in his adaptation of the Rosary to various circumstances and needs. For the sick, he promoted a simplified version that they could pray even in moments of intense pain. For peasants during their long work days, he suggested distributing the decades throughout the day, sanctifying the different moments of their labor. For nobles and rulers, he established special confraternities that committed them to defending the Catholic faith and practicing social justice under the patronage of the Virgin of the Rosary. Perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of his evangelizing strategy was the institution of the Rosary confraternities, associations of the faithful committed not only to the personal practice of this devotion, but also to its dissemination and to concrete acts of mercy inspired by the mysteries contemplated. The first of these confraternities, founded in Toulouse, set a model that soon spread to hundreds of European cities, creating a network of prayer and charity that transcended political borders and social differences, uniting Christendom under Mary's protective mantle. Chapter 9. The last years after the General Chapter held in Bologna in May 1221, Dominic, though already showing clear signs of physical exhaustion, embarked on one last apostolic journey through northern Italy. The stifling heat of the Italian summer, combined with his continuous penances and the exhausting pace of preaching he maintained, quickly deteriorated his already fragile health. In late July, while visiting his brethren in Venice, an intense fever forced him to return hastily to Bologna, sensing that his final encounter with the Lord was near. Upon arriving at the convent of San Niccolò in Bologna, Dominic tried to disguise the severity of his condition so as not to worry his friars, but his emaciated face and labored breathing revealed the seriousness of his state. The prior, alarmed, ordered that he be moved to a cell with better ventilation on the outskirts of the city, hoping that the pure air of the Bolognese hills would favor his recovery. There, understanding that his end was near, the saint summoned 12 of his closest friars to impart his spiritual testament. "Do not weep, my brothers," he said in a weak yet serene voice. "I will be more useful to you after my death than during my life." He exhorted them to persevere in evangelical poverty, in zeal for preaching the truth, and in filial devotion to the Most Holy Virgin. When one of the friars, anguished, asked where he wished to be buried, Dominic replied with the humility that had always characterized him, "Under the feet of my brothers," expressing his desire to be buried simply on the floor of the convent church, where the religious could tread upon his tomb, symbolizing his perpetual service to the community. As his condition worsened, he requested to be placed on a bed of ashes spread on the ground, as a sign of penance and final detachment. Surrounded by his spiritual children, who, through tears, recited prayers for the dying, Dominic fixed his gaze on a point invisible to the others, while an expression of ineffable joy illuminated his face. "I now see the heavens opened," he whispered, and extending his arms as if to embrace someone only he could see, he surrendered his soul to the Creator on August 6, 1221, the feast of the Transfiguration of the Lord. News of his death quickly spread throughout Bologna, provoking an extraordinary outpouring of public mourning. People from all social classes gathered in masses to venerate the body of the saintly preacher, as he was spontaneously called. Cardinal Ugolino, the future Pope Gregory IX, and a personal friend of Dominic, presided over the solemn funeral rites at the Church of San Niccolò, where the saint was buried according to his wish, in a simple tomb beneath the temple's floor. The numerous miracles that began to occur at his tomb confirmed the holiness that many had perceived in him during his earthly life. The blind regained their sight, the paralyzed began to walk, the possessed were freed from their torment, and above all, stubborn sinners experienced radical conversions after invoking his intercession. The supernatural fragrance that periodically emanated from his tomb, described by witnesses as the aroma of paradise, was interpreted as an unmistakable sign of his celestial glorification. Chapter 10. The Dominic Legacy. The seed planted by Dominic germinated with extraordinary rapidity after his death. In just a few decades, the order of preachers had spread throughout Europe, with hundreds of convents from Lisbon to Krakow, from Stockholm to Sicily. Its friars, trained in the finest universities, became prominent figures in intellectual life, holding chairs in Paris, Oxford, and Bologna, while keeping alive the ideal of poverty and itinerant preaching that had characterized their founder. Evangelization through knowledge became one of the most significant contributions of the Dominican charism to the medieval church. Albert the Great and his disciple Thomas Aquinas undertook the monumental task of reconciling the newly rediscovered Aristotelian philosophy with traditional Christian theology, building an intellectual synthesis that would definitively shape Western thought. Other Dominicans, such as Vincent Ferrer, Raymond of Peñafort, and Catherine of Siena, distinguished themselves for their holiness and their decisive influence in critical moments of ecclesiastical history, demonstrating that Dominic's legacy manifested itself both intellectually and apostolically. The devotion to the Holy Rosary, perhaps the most precious gift transmitted by the founder, experienced extraordinary development under the care of his spiritual children. The Rosary confraternities, established in virtually every city where Dominicans were present, united millions of the faithful from all social classes through this pious practice. Artists, inspired by the meditation on the mysteries, created some of the most moving masterpieces of Christian art, making visible to the unlettered what words explain to the educated. In the American lands, from the 16th century onward, the Dominicans became distinguished as tireless defenders of the dignity and rights of indigenous peoples. Friar Bartolomé de las Casas, transformed from an encomendero into a protector of the Indians, embodied with particular intensity the commitment to justice that is inseparable from the Dominican charism. In the Amazonian jungles, on the Andean plateaus, or in the Philippine missions, Dominic's followers planted the cross alongside the rosary, convinced that true evangelization must respect the human dignity of those being evangelized. The Dominican family progressively enriched itself with new branches and charismatic expressions. The Second Order, formed by contemplative nuns who supported the preaching of their brothers through prayer and penance. The Third Order, which allowed committed laypeople to live the Dominican spirit in the midst of the world, and numerous later founded religious congregations that adapted the original charism to new apostolic needs. All these ecclesial realities, diverse in their forms yet united in essence, testify to the spiritual fecundity of the project initiated by the Spanish saint 8 centuries ago. Chapter 11. The Spirituality of St. Dominic. Analyzing the spirituality of St. Dominic presents a particular difficulty. Unlike other founders, he left no personal writings that directly revealed his inner world. However, through the testimonies gathered during his canonization process, the first Dominican chronicles, and above all, the institutions he founded, we can reconstruct the essential features of his spiritual life, a harmonious synthesis of traditional elements and innovative aspects that formed an original path to holiness. Contemplation, was at the heart of his spiritual experience. Brother Rodolfo de Faenza, who closely lived with him, testified that by day no one was more sociable with his brothers and companions. By night, no one was more assiduous in vigils and prayers. This intense contemplative life was not an end in itself, but the source of his apostolic activity, following the principle later formulated by Thomas Aquinas: to contemplate and to give to others what one has contemplated. Dominic spent his nights in prayer and his days in preaching, establishing a life rhythm that perfectly integrated action and contemplation. Compassion for sinners and those who suffered deeply characterized his spirituality. Witnesses of his canonization process recalled seeing him weep frequently for human misery and the fate of sinners. "What shall become of the sinners?" he was heard lamenting during his nightly prayers. This compassion was not merely a feeling, but translated into active commitment for the salvation of souls through preaching, confession, and spiritual accompaniment. The saint himself confessed that he preferred to converse with sinners rather than with the righteous, for in them he clearly saw the opportunity to cooperate with divine mercy. Evangelical poverty, lived radically and communally, was another pillar of his spirituality. In a time when ecclesiastical wealth scandalized many and served as an argument for heretics, Dominic chose a voluntary poverty that gave credibility to his preaching. He always traveled on foot, rejected sumptuous possessions for his convents, and even sold his precious books to help the hungry. This choice for poverty was not merely an apostolic strategy, but a profound identification with Christ, who, though rich, became poor so that we might be enriched by his poverty. And the constant study of the Holy Scriptures decisively shaped his inner life. His contemporaries related that he always carried with him the Gospel of St. Matthew and the epistles of St. Paul, which he knew almost by heart. This intimate familiarity with the Word of God nourished both his preaching and his prayer, creating a fruitful cycle between reading, meditation, contemplation, and proclamation that later crystallized in the method of Lectio Divina, so characteristic of Dominican spirituality. Marian devotion permeates the entire spiritual experience of Dominic. His relationship with the Virgin Mary was not limited to external devotional practices, but deeply shaped his understanding of the Christian mystery and his evangelizing method. He saw in Mary the perfect model of a disciple and apostle who kept and meditated on the Word in her heart before bringing it to others. The Rosary, which he received by her hands according to tradition, perfectly expressed that union between Marian contemplation and Christological proclamation that characterizes all true evangelization. Chapter 12. Prayer to Saint Dominic. O blessed Dominic, tireless apostle of truth and father of preachers, who with your life and teachings illuminated the Church of Christ in times of darkness and confusion, you who received from the Most Holy Virgin the Holy Rosary as a celestial weapon against error and sin, teach us to love and meditate upon its mysteries with the same devotion that set your heart ablaze. We humbly beg you to intercede for us before the throne of divine mercy. Grant the Church pastors according to the heart of Christ, that like you, they may be men of deep prayer and burning zeal for the salvation of souls. May they know how to unite, as you did, the solidity of doctrine with the testimony of charity, silent contemplation with the bold preaching of truth. Holy Father, who sold your most precious books to help the hungry, help us to live evangelical detachment in a world seduced by materialism. May we learn from you to value eternal goods above transient riches, and to share generously with our needy brothers and sisters what we have received from divine providence. You, who tirelessly traversed the roads of Europe carrying the light of the gospel, inspire in us a renewed missionary spirit. May we not be overcome by fatigue or discouragement in the face of the difficulties of our time, but strengthened by your example, work with hope in the Lord's vineyard. trusting that the seed sown with tears will be reaped with joy. O glorious patriarch, who on your deathbed promised to continue being useful to your children from heaven, look kindly upon all those who turn to you in their needs. Console the afflicted, strengthen the weak, enlighten the doubtful, convert sinners, and accompany the dying on their passage to eternity. And to all of us, pilgrims in this valley of tears, lead us along the sure path of the Holy Rosary until we behold, along with you and the Most Holy Virgin, the glorious face of Christ in the kingdom of heaven. Amen.